Okay, so today we're going to do muscle sense. And muscle sense is so, uh, comes after the somatosensory um, um, lesson because its receptors are uh, uh, again a representation of the body, but not what is on the body, but where your body is. Okay, and to experience that, the simplest thing you can do is put your hand out here and touch your nose. To do that without smashing your nose, you have to know where your fingers is. Okay, so all these receptors are underneath your skin, whereas the receptors we studied before were on your skin. And what they include is proprioception, which gives you your sense of where the position of your limb is, but also kinesthesia, your sense of movement, how fast the the, uh, uh, the limbs are moving. You got to know that so you can slow down in time. If you've got a slow movement to the nose, that's one thing. A fast movement to the nose, you sort of stops abruptly about an inch before the nose, just in case. So there's several receptors that that recognize what's beneath your skin and the shape of your body, and it's part of the wear strait. So where your hand is. Before we talked about the receptors on the skin, and they were most useful for figuring out what the shape of the object is that you're touching. And so that was part of the what strait. Now let's find out what some of the receptors are. There's one in here called the joint afferent, and it's located between the bones that you have at the joint, your hip joint, the joint of your elbow. Another receptor is called the muscle spindle, and it is located within the muscle itself. And it's very good at sensing both the position, the length of the muscle, and how fast that muscle is shortening or lengthening. I guess that's it. Oops, back we go. We haven't done them all yet. Okay. We also have the stuff we talked about last week. We said that the stretch of your skin and the compression of your skin gives you some idea where your fingers are. Okay, so some parts of your body rely on those receptors. Another one that we're going to talk about is called the Golgi tendon organ, located here at the tendon, the tendon that attaches the muscle to the bone. Okay. So there's a receptor located there. So those are the four receptors that are involved in proprioception and kinesthesia. There's another not receptor, but also something heavily involved, is your internal sense of effort. So when you uh, move your hand, you generate chorally discharge, and that chorally discharge is used to give you a sense of how hard the muscles are contracting, and therefore how fast the hand might be moving. Now, different receptors are better for different things. The spindles are very good both for position and for velocity. Velocity, you might remember speed, how fast the hand is moving. The Golgi tendon organ that we just looked at is excellent at measuring how much force the muscle is generating. Some afferents are more important in some body parts and some in others. And the brain learns to figure out which might be more accurate, So if you have a miss or something like that in what action you're doing, it figures, the brain says, that receptor was misleading me. So it starts relying on the other ones. Now, if a receptor is lost, the other receptors also provide some of the missing information. So patients with artificial joints lack those joint receptors, but their position sense is also almost normal from the spindles. The position of the hand is quite reasonable when the skin of the hand is anesthetized. So let's suppose you put a cuff here and you stop the blood pressure from entering your hand. Your hand goes numb. But you can still tell what the position of your fingers are. Now, the reason for this is that the muscles for most of your fingers are located here in the arm area, the muscles themselves. So even though your hand goes numb, all that's actually pulling on your finger is a tendon that's connected to a muscle that's in the arm. So the arm isn't anesthetized, but the hand is. But the spindles are in the arm, and so they could still act quite normally. And again, if there's no afferent input at all, you can get a sense of position from your choroid discharge. There was a good article I read about a patient who had lost all sensory sensation, but he could still drive his old car, and that it was a manual, so he had to have move the gears back and forth, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and he could do it quite well. He did that because of choroid discharge. He sensed that if he moved this, he remembered from the past that if he moved this hand with this force in this direction, he would get to gear number 3. He bought a new car and he couldn't drive it because, again, that new car, its gears had a different force requirements. And the only way he could drive it is by looking at his hand, and that's not very good for looking at the windshield at the same time. So he had to go back to his old car, fix it all up, and he stayed with that. Okay, the spindles. You can see here those yellow things there are the spindles. There's many thousands of them in any one of your muscles. And you can see that the muscle itself changing length, so getting longer and shorter. And these things are in parallel with the rest of your muscle fibers. So the spindle is surrounded by muscle fibers on either side. So they're in parallel with each other. So this makes it ideal for measuring what the muscle length is and how fast it's being contracted. And from that, you can figure out, the brain can figure out what the position of the joint that it's attached to is. Now you can see here the Golgi tendon organ, this muscle is popping a little too quickly. The animation needs a little adjustment. But anyways, when you contract your muscles, so do an active contraction of your muscles, these things get stretched. And so they are very good at telling you how hard the muscle is being stretched, how much force you're generating. The spindles have large diameter fibers coming out of it, and they're called the 1A fiber, and small diameter fiber coming out of it, called the 2 fiber. This one here, these numbers here tell you are in proportion to how large the fiber is. So 1A is the thickest, 2 is thinner, and we'll get in. There's a 1B that's coming from the tendon organ. So that's between this one and this one in thickness. Okay. Here is one of the fibers inside this spindle, and it's called the nuclear bag fiber. Why nuclear? I'm not sure. But bag because it's wider here in the middle. And what you can see here is that it adapts quickly once the motion, the stretch is finished. It's a little bit like your Cassini effort. When you press on it, it fires. When you stop pressing on it, and you still continue pressing on it, it quickly dissipates. It only starts firing actively during just the beginning of the press. The same thing here. This thing fires as it's being stretched. So it's very good at giving you a phasic response during the stretch, and that phasic response helps tell what the velocity is. This is another fiber in the spindle, and it's called the chain fiber. The chain fiber is because it's sort of even throughout, and it doesn't have any bump in the middle. Its surrounded or with a 1A fiber, one of the thick ones, and also one of the thin ones. Now notice here that this fires in proportion to how long the fiber is, how long the fiber becomes. So notice when here it's firing slowly, and now it's firing quickly. The more you stretch it, the harder it fires. So it's a good fiber for telling you what the length is of the muscle, and in turn, the position of, let's say, your hand. Now, we'll compare the response of the spindle and the Golgi tendon organ to two movements. The first one is a passive muscle stretch. So, for example, let's say you put your hand here and somebody else pulls on your hand. Okay, so that the muscle in your biceps gets stretched, but without any effort on your part. Okay? So this is becoming longer when somebody else stretches it. And let's see what's happening to the 1As. You can see, well, 1As and 2As, what's happening to the spindle. Now there are different colored dots coming out. One is coming out from the chain fiber, and you can see that both the 1As and 2s increase their firing rate when the muscle gets longer. You also see these green dots coming out, and you can see that those green dots come out only during the stretch. So, and that innervation for the green dot comes and joins the 1A fiber. So the 1A fiber fires both for position and velocity because it's attached to both fibers. The secondary is just attached to the chain fiber, so it just signals position. In contrast, you can see that the 1B fiber isn't changing its activity much because your muscle is relaxed and not much change in tension or force is being exerted onto the tendon. Now, if instead you do an active contraction, for example, if you put your hand under the table and then pull your hand up, again, if we're considering this muscle as the biceps contracts, its middle gets wider, but as it contracts, it stretches the Golgi tendon, and its activity increases sharply. So the Golgi tendon organ signals how much force the muscle is being exerted. You'll also note that there's some activity when the muscle is here, but none during the contraction, because the muscle is shortening. Okay? Here it's lengthening, here it's shortening, here it's lengthening, here it's shortening. So during the contraction, it becomes silent. Okay. These afferents coming from the spindles, you can make them you can increase the volume control on them. You can make them more or less sensitive. And the thing that adjusts the sensitivity or the volume is this gamma static and gamma dynamic. Dynamic because it goes to the one with a bump in it, the bag fibers, and static because it goes to the chain fibers, because the signal position. So the word dynamic is used for something that signals some change in a phasic or dynamic way. This one is sort of the activity goes slowly up and then slowly down. That's more static. That's, I guess, the origin of the name of these two. Now, these fibers are adapted from normal muscle fibers, and the ends of these fibers are still act like normal muscle fibers. And when a signal comes from the brain, these ends contract. And when the ends contract, they pull on the middle portion of the fiber, making them more sensitive. Now, this is the activity we see with no gamma. So both the bag here, which signals velocity, produces a weak phasic response, and the chain fiber signals changes in position, but with little change between when it's short and when it's long. If now we have the same thing, but now with gamma static drive going to these chain fibers, if you compare here to here, you will see that there's a lot of more activity during when the muscle is long than it is here. So both the 1As and the secondaries or 2s increase their sensitivity to what the position or length of the fiber is, and therefore the position of where your hand is. If the gamma dynamic drive increases, it pulls on the bag fiber, making it more sensitive. And so the 1A fiber here, and only the 1A fiber here, becomes more velocity sensitive. So more sensitive to how the speed is increasing. There's no changes coming from the secondaries. Now, we mentioned before that when the muscle contracts, as in now, the spindle is silent, okay, because it gets shorter. And this is what happens when you have no gamma drive. You're just contracting the muscle, but not the spindle. If, on the other hand, you contract both, this is the alpha fiber, so the alpha motor neuron is the motor neuron that activates the muscle. The gamma ones are the ones that activate the spindles. So when you contract both of them together, that's called alpha-gamma coactivation. And when you do that, you maintain the spindle sensitivity and you have no pause in activity. And there are situations where you want that to happen. Okay, next what we'll do is consider 3 spinal reflexes, each involving a different receptor, and we'll figure out what the circuit is, what the stimulus is that activates the circuit, and what its function is. Okay. Here is the monosynaptic stretch reflex, which is activated by the spindle 1A afferents. Okay. That signal comes from the muscle, goes to the spinal cord, and provides activation to these alpha motor neurons. Remember, these alpha motor neurons, I said, activate the muscle itself. So what happens? When you stretch, you get an increase from the spindle. That spindle activates the muscle through the circuit, and the muscle contracts, and you get back to where you were before. So this is a reflex that regulates length. And because it's monosynaptic, just one synapse, and because it's coming from the 1As, which are the thickest of all your fibers, it has the shortest latency of all your spinal reflexes. What about this one? The afferent coming from your Golgi tendon organ. Okay, you notice that it's going into the spinal cord as well, but it's hitting this other neuron here before hitting the motor neuron here. This other neuron here is given a different color because it's producing an inhibitory influence on the motor neuron. So what happens here? We, for some reason, get lots of activity in the muscle. That activates the GTO, Golgi tendon organ. That activates this inhibitory neuron. And that in turn reduces the activity that's going to the muscle, and the muscle force gets back to normal. So this circuit regulates force. It tries to keep force constant. And that's very useful in tasks like holding hot cups of coffee. You can imagine that you pick up a hot cup of coffee automatically, you would get one from Tim Hortons, one of these paper cups, and it's hot. And so it's difficult to hold. And if you hold it too weakly, it's going to drop out of your hands. If, on the other hand, you press too hard, you'll have another effect which you don't like either. The third reflex that I want to talk to you about, that comes from pain and cutaneous receptors. and they involve quite a complex circuit of several neurons in the spinal cord, and also neurons that cross over to the other side and activate a string of neurons, both ending in a motor neuron or an alpha motor neuron that will contract a muscle. You notice that this side goes to a flexor muscle, that is something that will lift your leg, while as this one goes to extensor muscle that will sort of straighten out your leg. So when you step on something sharp, you see that this muscle contracts, that lifts the leg from that sharp object. At the same time, you can see that the reflex goes over to the other side, extending this leg and keeping you stable. So you're standing on one leg now with this leg extended. So that's done rather automatically. And that's one example of afferents coming from these two receptors. Tremor. Now, we talked about gamma activity, and we said that if you increase the gamma activity, you'll increase the sensitivity. Question is, why don't you just keep it high all the time? Why don't you make it as sensitive as possible at all times? And it seems like a more sensitive receptor is more accurate. Well, too much of a good thing can be a problem. It can cause tremor. Now, I don't know if you've had had trouble, for example, threading a needle. When you thread a needle and try very hard to get the thread into the needle hole, your hands start to shake. And those of you that might go into medicine might find during their first surgeries that their hands might start to shake when you start stitching the wound back together again. Now, normally, okay, when your muscle, when something stretches your muscle, you get activity, and this produces a contraction which moves your muscle left. But as you're doing it, you're stretching the triceps, the muscles on the opposite side. Let's watch that again. So this gets longer. That activates the muscle. That muscle pulls, stretching this muscle. And stretching this muscle produces an activation in this reflex. And this is then what stops the movement in the correct position. Yes?
I just think your laptop is about to die. I'm not sure if you
No, I didn't see that. Can somebody come up here and give me a hand? I have in my backpack, there is a charger. Hopefully, I think a cord just long enough to reach to there. It's sort of down deep in one of the bags. My backpack has 1,000 little bags in it. It can hide things anywhere. But you keep looking and you'll find a charger at the bottom of the bag. And thank you for pointing this out. Any luck?
Yep, I found it.
Great. So I think it'll plug in there,
Yeah.
and I think that might reach to here.
I just see it like this.
Good.
Yeah, he didn't ask.
Where
Like the room.
the lecture can continue. Thank you. Okay. So what happens if you have high gamma activity? I think this is it. No, this is the normal one. Okay. You can see that it stops it in the right position, as we explained. If instead we go to here, you can see that the arm keeps going back and forth. We're getting tremor. And that's because there's too much activity coming from the spindles. You can see here how much activity is coming. That produces a huge contraction of this muscle. That in turn pulls this tricep really fast, and that really fast movement also generates tons of activity, which then pulls the biceps. And it goes back and forth like that, and you have tremor. And you can have normal tremor, like when you try to put thread in a needle, but you can also get all kinds of abnormal tremor when you have different lesions. One of the lesions you can have is in your cerebellum, and that will cause tremor. Now, the reasons things like the cerebellum can cause tremor is because this reflex that we've been talking about involves not just this reflex, but has other pathways. When this gets stretched, you notice that activity also goes up at this point, crosses over, up the dorsal column to the DCN and to the thalamus and through 3A and whoops, not 45 minutes. Sorry. Not quite. Anyways, comes back down again. And so you get one activity coming this way, and then quite a bit later, you got activity coming back down that goes through the cortex. This thing in the cortex can, most times in healthy people, be influenced by structures like the cerebellum that make the movements very accurate. It can also, when the cerebellum is damaged, produce that tremor that we talked about just a minute ago. But most times it adds the little bit of skill that you need for throwing a ball and catching it. We did two experiments here. The first one, or the second one actually, that we did, was vibrate this tendon here. Okay, vibrating this tendon here is not what the important thing. It's that vibrating that tendon stretches this muscle and activates the spindle. And the spindle on this hand is more active. So the brain senses the normal activity that it would get for this position, plus the activity it gets from the vibrator. So as a consequence then, the other limb signals what position it thinks this limb is by being too long, by being too stretched. Okay. The other thing that we saw was that if the muscle was not contracted, the other arm could sense its position accurately. But it could also do so when the muscle was contracted. Contraction doesn't seem to alter your sense of what the position of your hand is. Now, how is that? We saw that activating the gamma drive increased the sensitivity. And you'd expect then that this muscle would sense a different position than when it's contracted versus when it's relaxed. Well, it does so by means of our old friend quality discharge. The brain sends down a signal, alpha gamma coactivation. The alpha contracts the muscle, the gamma increases the sensitivity. That goes back up to the brain. I say the brain because we're not quite sure where that is. But that structure also receives a corollary discharge. Okay, so how much activity comes down this way subtracts from the activity that comes up from the spindle. So when the muscle is relaxed, you get little activity coming from the spindle, and that goes up here. But there's also little activity coming from corollary discharge, so that you get some sense of position. Now, in the other case, when the muscle is highly contracted, you get a lot of sensitivity in the spindle, lots of activity coming back from the spindle, but that gets subtracted out by the high corollary discharge. So you sense the same position here as you sensed when the muscle was relaxed. Okay. So try, all of you need a little bit of exercise. Close your eyes and touch your two fingers together. No, not open your eyes. Do this. It's a little harder. But notice that you can do that quite well. You miss a little bit, but it's amazingly accurate. So your brain knows where this hand is, and it knows where this hand is, and can put the two together. Okay? Now, that's a remarkable achievement, because how does it know where each hand is? Now, we talked about spindles and they tell you the position, but they tell you the position of each of the joints. And that signal goes to the 1A region, where you have a map of the entire body. And it tells, for example, how long your muscle is or how fast it's moving. And that gives you a signal. Let's say it's, in this case, what your elbow angle is. So that's what's coded in this position. Somewhere else, you also have what your shoulder angle is. Somewhere else you have where your hand angle is. So all these things are coded separately. The shoulder angle, the elbow angle, the hand angle. And to be able to get an idea of where your finger is, you have to combine all these signals. Now that occurs over here in the where stream, the stream that tells you where your body parts are. And it tells you where the egocentric finger position is. So it tells you where your finger is relative to you, your own body. Now, one of the things is, this is a nested reference frame. We saw before an example of a nested allocentric frame in terms of an apple on a table. If we move the table, we move the apple as well. Here, if we change the angle of the shoulder, we move the finger as well. So that's what we mean by nested. What happens to this finger is dependent on what all these other angles are that it's attached to. Now, like all your sensory systems, there is, from this somatosensory system, two streams. A where stream, the one we just covered, and also a what stream that goes to a place called S2, which is more on the side of the parietal cortex. And that is involved in telling you about helps you tell what things are. So you have to be able to know what size this mouse is. You have to know the positions of your fingers relative to this mouse. So it helps you figure out what the shape of the mouse is. So that's why it's called the what stream. You need that signal to help it. And it works in allocentric coordinates. So, and then it goes into this secondary somatosensory cortex called S2. And patients without S2 can't do this stereognosis that we talked about last week. So they can't identify an object that they're holding. And that's it.